Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this cozy scene in the woods, a little snack time with coffee and bread on a broken tree trunk. Let's start by sketching it out. The tree trunk will be the largest item or element, so I'm going to sketch it out first. I want to figure out the angle, the position, and also the size according to the space that I have. Like usual, when I'm sketching, I like to hold my pencil quite far back so the lines can be more loose and light. This way it's much easier to erase and move things around. Once I'm happy with the tree trunk, I'm going to add the mug and the bread. I also want to add a piece of cloth underneath, which I feel gives more of a cozy feeling. To add more of a woodsy feel, I'm going to add a bunch of mushrooms growing out of the tree trunk. This is just to remind myself as I paint later, but I'm going to add some cracks and textures around the tree trunk so it doesn't look like a perfect cylinder. So that's basically the main subject or the focal point of this whole painting. The rest will be plants surrounding the tree trunk, helping to frame the composition, which I'm just going to sketch very loosely to indicate the position and height so it fits the overall composition. As for the colors, this is Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Vermilion by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, and I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm also going to add some outlines. You can use an ink pen, but personally I'm going to use my watercolor colored pencils. These are just hobby grade pencils by Faber Castell, but you can use any regular colored pencils as well. Since there are plants in front of the tree trunk, I'm going to paint them first. I'm going to use Terre Verte as the main green, a little bit of Permanent Yellow Deep to make the color a bit brighter, and Burnt Umber to slightly mute and make the color look more earthy. I like to paint the leaves in clusters because they don't usually grow by themselves, and for the stem to connect them together, I'm going to use the same mixture with more burnt umber in the ratio. For the stem, I switched to my small brush and I'm using a thick consistency and a dry brush load, so it's much easier to control and create thin lines. Next, for the tall grass, I'm using the same color mixture, but I want to create some color variation at the bottom to darken it slightly. So while the surface is still damp, I use the same mix with added indigo. On the right hand side of the trunk, I'm going to paint a small fern. I drew out the main stem and the stem on the sides first using my small brush. Then I'm going to use a pretty thick consistency of the green that I've already premixed on my palette to paint on the really tiny leaves growing from either side of the tiny stems. To paint this, I just use the tip of my brush to create dots. Sometimes if there's a bit of space, I extend the dot slightly so it's a little bit longer like an oval, but I just basically try to fill in the empty stems. I'm going to paint a second one that is positioned behind the previous fern, and for this I'm going to use a darker green so this has a bit more indigo, and I also use a slightly thicker consistency. For the ground, I used the premixed green that I already had, which has Terre Verte, Burnt Umber, and Permanent Yellow Deep. Then I added some Jaune Brilliant Dark to the mix as well. I'm using a light to medium consistency and a pretty heavy load on my brush so I can spread it around the bottom. You can make the edges slightly textured, but I want mine to look illustrative, so I made the edges wavy but clean. Since I already have a lot of green on my palette, I might as well just paint the plant behind the tree trunk as well. For this one, I want it to be taller, so I started with the stem from a mix of burnt umber and indigo, and I use a darker green for the leaves, so it's different from the leaves in the foreground. To simplify painting these leaves, I like to think of painting 3 separate main leaves and 2 smaller ones at the back, while they all grow from the same point or the center. After I've painted a few leaves in a medium consistency, I'm also going to add some lighter ones which I paint in a lighter consistency for the ones behind the previous leaves I painted. This way it'll just create a slight illusion of depth. Once I've painted the leaves, I'm going to switch to my small brush again to paint the stems using the same brown as before. I try to place the stem as if they're growing from the larger main stem, or it can also grow from another point as long as it makes sense and it's not all over the place. I also didn't really care if the greens are completely dry or not because I don't mind the slight change in color if they're still slightly damp. I feel like the green is a bit too dense, so to break it up and to add a pop of color, I decided to just paint red berries using a thick consistency of vermilion. Next, for the mushroom, I used the same color as the ground and I added a touch of vermilion so the tone is slightly more creamy and it looks more pinkish instead of yellowish. For the bottom of the bread, I used Jaune Brilliant with Permanent Yellow Deep, and as I got towards the top, I added some burnt umber with vermilion, and I used a really thick consistency right at the tip of the bread to make it look more baked. For the cup, I'm using a medium consistency of indigo, and preferably you want the bread to completely dry because the blue might end up traveling into the bread like it did with mine, but I just saved it with tissue and dried off the surface before painting it again. For a little bit of variation, I'm going to darken the rim of the mug. I added burnt umber into the indigo to create a darker version of the color, and I'm just going to paint around it while leaving the inside of the mug empty. I'm going to leave them to dry and move back to the tall grass. I added the midribs or a slight detail to the tall grass using my small brush with a medium consistency of the greens that I've already had on my palette. I'm going to keep the drink simple. I just used burnt umber in a medium consistency, and I also left out some white negative space as highlight. For the base color of the cloth, I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant with some Prussian blue and burnt umber, and then I added a touch of Permanent Yellow Deep as well for a variation in color. And since I want this to be very light, I ended up taking off the excess while the surface is still damp with some tissue. For the cloud shadow, I used a really light consistency mix of Prussian blue and burnt umber for this gray, and again I'm painting it on while the surface of the cloth is still slightly damp. I'm going to wait for everything to dry and move on to paint the plants behind the tree trunk. For this, since I still have a lot of green on my palette, I just ended up using the mixture that I've already pre-mixed to paint the stems with my small brush and the leaves with my larger brush. For a bit of depth, I use a thicker consistency of burnt umber as an additional detail to the coffee or the tea. Now let's move on to the tree trunk. For this, I use a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark with a bit of burnt umber and some vermilion. I'm using a really heavy brush load so I can spread the paint around the large area inside of the tree trunk while avoiding painting on the outer part or the outer layer of the bark. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to take off a little bit of paint with tissue. This is just in a random area to give a bit of texture. Then I added a thicker consistency of the same mix at the center. Then using a clean dry brush, I'm going to pick up that wet paint and move it around to create a round or a radial pattern. For the layer of the bark that we can see from this side, I just use burnt umber in a medium consistency. To paint the outer bark, I'm not really concerned if the inside is still a little bit damp as long as it's not puddling wet. Then once everything is completely dry, I'm going to start painting on the texture starting from the center using a thick consistency of burnt umber. Then for the outer pattern, I tried to use a light consistency of burnt umber and I created circles or radial lines in layers. But while doing this, I tried to make the lines slightly wavy and uneven so it looks more natural. I'm going to add some deep cracks on the tree trunk, and for this I use a mix of burnt umber and indigo. I also switched to my small brush. I just created jagged lines randomly, making sure that they're not evenly apart, and I also tried to aim them to the center. As for the outer layer of the tree trunk or the bark, I use the same mix of burnt umber and indigo in a medium consistency. Since there are a lot of things in the way, I usually like to outline the surrounding area first, like the grass, the mushrooms, and things like that. This way it's much easier to fill in the rest of the space. I like to play around with the ratio of the colors, so sometimes I use more burnt umber or sometimes I add more indigo for darker brown. I place most of the darker value at the bottom of the tree trunk where it's close to the ground and it's slightly hidden behind some of the tall grass. For the top part, instead of using a different color, I'm just going to use a thin consistency of the same brown. And I'm also being very careful behind the small ferns, not to leave it completely blank. Once some parts of the light bark is dry, I'm going to use a slightly thicker consistency to paint some lines following the direction of the growth. The base has to be completely dry though in order for the texture to show up, if not it's just going to blend with the base. Underneath the mushrooms, I'm going to use a thick consistency of the brown. This is to separate them from the color of the bark so they can stand out a bit more. I'm also going to add a darker value underneath the cloth, then use Jaune Brilliant in a light consistency to paint the steam coming out of the mug. I'm going to go back to the light part of the bark again, and here I'm using a thicker consistency to paint especially around the edges, adding a bit more deep cracks. After looking at the surrounding plants, I felt like there's too much empty space behind the plants that I painted earlier, so I'm using the green that I already had on my palette in a thin consistency to just fill in some of the space, and I'm also going to add more grass textures and rocks on the ground so it doesn't look too empty. Next, I'm going to paint the pattern on the cloth. For this, I'm using a thick consistency of vermilion that I mixed with a bit of burnt umber so the color is not too bright. And I'm just painting on random patterns. Here you can also create other patterns like berries or flowers and things like that. Next, I'm going to go back to the green leaves again and paint on some details like the ribs. And I also used my small brush for this to make it much easier to control the lines. I'm going to glaze the bread after this using a mix of burnt umber, permanent yellow deep, and vermilion, and at the bottom I'm going to use a thicker consistency and a dark brown to help line and thicken the glaze. Next, I'm going to paint the pattern on the mug. For this, I'm using bleed-proof white in a medium to thick consistency, and just like the cloth, I'm making things up as I go, but you can also create other patterns that you have in mind. I'm going to add some embellishment for the edge of the fabric, and I'm going to use bleed-proof white to paint it, so I want to make sure that the base is slightly darker so there's enough contrast. I layered a little bit of dark brown and I dried it off completely before using bleed-proof white to paint the embellishments. I just start with dots and then I added some lines for the frayed fabric for each dot. Lastly, I'm going to add some dots for extra decorative elements. I always like adding them in different sizes very lightly, especially for woodsy scenes, maybe to represent some pollen that is catching light. Now I'm just going to outline and add textures to the elements here to define each object. And for smaller areas, if it's a bit hard to draw on the details, I'm just going to use my pencil like the midribs of smaller leaves. I'm going to make the outlines a little bit thicker for the bread and the mug since they're the main subject of this painting, so I want them to stand out a little bit more. Here I'm just using a really thin consistency of bleed-proof white to extend the steam to the drink, and I'm going to darken it slightly so it stands out against the white of the paper. I'm also going to use my pencil to realign the vegetation in front of the tree trunk to make the edges cleaner. And I'm also going to add a lot of texture for the inside of the tree trunk as well as the tree bark, since the pencil is much more controllable and it's easier to add a lot of details. Here I'm adding textures to the cap of the mushrooms to give more detail, and this way it'll separate it further from the texture of the tree trunk. I felt like the short grass looked a bit messy, so I ended up going over some of them using bleed-proof white, and I also extended the height. This will then give me a white background to work on and paint with more green. Preferably, I want the white to completely dry before adding on the green, but I was too impatient to wait. And while I'm at it, I also added more grass texture since I felt like the ground looks a bit too bare. I still felt like the steam needs a bit more definition here, so I used the light gray pencil to outline the large main steam. I really like the texture on the mushroom, so I'm going to do something similar to the small rocks as well. Then I'm going to outline all of the leaves because I felt like they're a little bit too washed out compared to the rest of the composition. For the inside of the tree trunk, I'm going to add more hairline cracks or just textures aimed towards the center, and I also darken the edges of the cracks near the bark so it looks deeper and larger than the rest. Here I'm going to increase the darker value on the tree bark, especially between the mushrooms and also underneath the cloth. And that's basically it for this painting. This one was super cozy to paint, which I find is perfect for the season, so I hope you enjoy it as well. If you did, don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links and the link to this outline will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!